I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
The room had been prepared for a routine royal briefing, but Princess Anne arrived carrying something nobody expected, a sealed folder, and a decision she had no intention of softening. Within minutes, Queen Camilla's place inside one of the monarchy's most sensitive discussions was being openly challenged. Charles had spent years preventing private tensions from becoming institutional battles. But this time, his sister had forced the issue into the open, and silence was no longer an option. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew everyone gathered at Windsor understood the stakes. The briefing concerned succession planning, the process for deciding how royal duties and authority would continue if the king could no longer oversee every matter himself. William sat nearby, silent, while Camilla expected her usual place beside her husband. Then Anne stepped forward, set a sealed protocol dossier beside Charles, and declared that Camilla would not join the succession discussion until the monarch formally defined the limits of her authority. Anne did not raise her voice. She simply ordered the Queen's chair removed from the inner table. Camilla stared as though an aide had made a mistake, but when she turned toward the Princess Royal, the answer came without hesitation. It was deliberate. Humiliation struck instantly. She looked to Charles, expecting him to reverse the order, yet he remained silent. That pause cut deeper than Anne's challenge, because Camilla understood her husband was considering it. William watched his father's expression change. The future king knew this was no longer a family disagreement. Anne opened the dossier and explained that it recorded moments when Camilla's informal influence had crossed into decisions normally reserved for the sovereign, the heir, or senior working royals. A protocol dossier, in plain terms, was a formal file documenting rules, decisions, and responsibilities inside the royal household. Anne insisted she was defending a boundary, not attacking a marriage. Charles finally moved. He closed his hand over the folder and asked every official to leave except Anne, Camilla, and William. Camilla's face tightened. Anne remained composed. The king's decision to clear the room confirmed that he was taking the accusation seriously. Then Anne delivered the warning that changed everything. She told Charles the evidence did not begin with one disagreement. It led back to a royal ceremony, one decision by Camilla, and one moment Anne had never forgotten. And as Charles finally opened the dossier his sister had brought into the room, the confrontation stopped being about a chair, because inside those pages was the history of three people whose loyalties had become dangerously entangled. For Charles, this was never simply a disagreement between two powerful women. One was the sister who had stood beside him through decades of royal pressure, family scandal, grief, and transition. The other was the woman for whom he had fought through years of controversy to build a place at his side. Now Anne and Camilla were demanding answers from the same man, and whichever direction Charles turned, somebody he loved would believe he had betrayed them. Charles knew Anne better than almost anyone in that room. She had never been the kind of sister who softened difficult truths just to protect his feelings. When the Princess Royal spoke bluntly, he understood there was usually a reason behind it. She had watched him carry the burden of the crown through family fractures and relentless pressure, and she had stood beside him when loyalty mattered most. That was precisely why her challenge now cut so deeply. She was not speaking as an enemy. She believed silence had become more dangerous than confrontation. Camilla carried an entirely different wound. She had spent years fighting to be accepted beside Charles, enduring public judgment before finally becoming queen. For her, joining senior royal discussions was more than procedure. It was proof that she was no longer standing at the edge of the institution. So when the room emptied, she turned toward her husband and asked the question she could no longer suppress. Had he known Anne intended to exclude her? Charles answered immediately. No. For a heartbeat, Camilla seemed relieved. Then she noticed what he did not say. He did not dismiss Anne's objection. He did not call everyone back. He did not order the chair restored. The Queen's expression tightened as reassurance gave way to something colder, the realization that Charles was actually considering his sister's demand. Anne saw the pain on her brother's face and briefly softened, but she would not retreat. Protecting Charles personally, she told him, could not mean allowing authority around the crown to become blurred. The crown, in simple terms, meant the sovereign's official power and duties. not merely the person wearing the title. Anne believed too many uncomfortable questions had been postponed, and resentment had grown in the silence. William remained near the mantel, hands clasped, until his father finally asked what he thought. The prince answered carefully. Camilla's dignity should be protected, he said, but succession authority had to remain unmistakable. Charles looked down instead of replying. That was when Camilla understood the true danger. Anne had not come to Windsor to make a symbolic protest. She had come expecting a ruling. Charles finally looked at his sister. When did you decide this had gone too far? Anne named a ceremony from several weeks earlier. And suddenly, everything shifted, because the confrontation at Windsor had not begun that morning at all. Its true beginning came during a ceremony where one seemingly small instruction from Camilla convinced Anne that the monarchy's internal balance was quietly shifting. Long before Anne ordered Camilla's chair removed, there had been another chair, another room, and another decision that appeared insignificant to almost everyone present. But Anne noticed it. She noticed who gave the instruction, who hesitated before obeying, and most importantly, who remained silent. What happened during that ceremony lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet for the Princess Royal, it became the point of no return the instant she decided that someone eventually had to tell Charles what nobody else would. Anne remembered the Windsor reception with uncomfortable clarity. Several weeks earlier, Charles had approved a careful seating and speaking order for an event honoring long-serving charitable representatives. William was meant to deliver the closing remarks immediately after his father, a deliberate signal of continuity between the king and the future monarch. Anne had been given responsibility for the ceremonial introductions. In royal terms, ceremonial order simply meant the agreed sequence of who speaks, sits, or performs official duties during an event. To most people, it looked formal. To Anne, it carried meaning. Camilla arrived shortly before the reception began and studied the program. She thought the arrangement felt too rigid. Without speaking to Charles first, she quietly asked a household aide to move her remarks ahead of William's and alter the seating. Then came the moment Anne never forgot. The Princess Royal entered, just as the aide was lifting her place card from the chair beside Charles. Camilla had instructed that Anne be moved, and that she take the seat herself. Anne stopped. She picked up the displaced card, looked directly at the aide, and asked only, "Who authorized this?" Camilla answered for him. She had. Anne did not argue. She returned the card to its original place and said the approved order would remain. But Charles arrived in time to catch the final seconds of the exchange. He understood something had happened. He also saw guests beginning to gather. Rather than challenge either woman, the king chose to start the reception. That silence stayed with Anne. She did not believe Charles agreed with Camilla. What troubled her was something more painful. Her brother seemed increasingly willing to avoid a confrontation simply because confronting his wife carried too much history. Then, later that evening, Anne learned the seating change had not been the only instruction. Camilla had also asked that briefing papers normally sent directly to William first pass through her office for coordination. That crossed a line. Anne began keeping a private record of altered instructions, changed arrangements, and decisions that seemed to blur authority. Not gossip, not personal resentment, a documented pattern. That record became the dossier now sitting in front of Charles. But before the king could reach a conclusion, Camilla turned toward Anne and demanded that they stop speaking through papers and speak directly. The memories inside that dossier made Charles uncomfortable, but Camilla was no longer willing to defend herself through paperwork, and when she faced Anne, years of carefully contained tension were about to become painfully personal. Camilla had endured criticism from newspapers, commentators, courtiers, and strangers for decades. She had learned how to absorb hostility without showing it, but this was different. Princess Anne was not attacking from outside the monarchy. She was speaking from its very center, and she had just questioned whether Camilla could be trusted near decisions affecting its future. The Queen turned away from Charles, faced Anne directly, and demanded the one thing the Princess Royal had never been afraid to give an unfiltered answer. Camilla's anger came quickly. With the door closed and the aides outside, she told Anne that any disagreement over protocol could have been handled privately. Protocol, in plain terms, meant the rules and procedures that determined how official royal duties were carried out. Instead, she said, Anne had turned a family dispute into a formal challenge in front of Charles and William. The humiliation was obvious, but beneath it sat something deeper. She felt judged all over again. Anne did not retreat. She reminded Camilla that they had already spoken privately twice. Both times, the Princess Royal had asked her to let official responsibilities pass through established channels, rather than personal offices. Anne's voice stayed controlled, but the restraint made every word sharper. She believed those warnings had been dismissed, and now the consequences were sitting on the table between them. Camilla stepped closer. "Do you believe I don't belong here?" Anne paused. For the first time, the force drained slightly from her expression. Then she answered. This was not about whether Camilla belonged beside Charles. It was about whether standing beside the king automatically gave her authority that belonged to the crown itself. The distinction struck hard. Camilla reminded Anne of the years she had spent under public scrutiny, the criticism, the rejection, and the painful path toward finally being accepted into royal life. She accused the Princess Royal of reopening an old judgment the family had supposedly left behind. Anne answered that acceptance and authority were not the same thing. Charles finally intervened. He told both women that years of personal history would not decide a question about future royal governance. Governance, in this context, meant who could make or influence official decisions affecting the monarchy's structure and succession. His voice remained controlled, but as he closed Anne's dossier, his hand trembled. Then Anne revealed the document that changed the argument. One page contained an instruction involving William's future responsibilities, altered in Camilla's handwriting. Charles had never approved the change. Camilla immediately insisted she had only been trying to streamline communication, not seize control. Charles said nothing for several seconds. Then he asked Anne and Camilla to leave separately. William was to remain. The Queen understood what that meant. So did Anne. The argument had exposed the wound, but the next decision would determine whether it healed or permanently changed the balance of the royal family. Because once that door closed behind Anne and Camilla, Charles was left alone with the man who would one day inherit everything. There was no dramatic audience now, no raised voices, no confrontation across a royal table. Only Charles and William remained, father and son sitting with the same dossier between them. For the first time that day, the argument became brutally simple. Charles could protect Camilla from humiliation by rejecting Anne's challenge, or he could establish boundaries that might wound his wife, but prevent uncertainty from following William into the future. Either decision would carry a personal price. William chose his words carefully. Camilla's importance to Charles was not being questioned, and neither was the place she held beside him. The danger, he said, was something quieter. Staff naturally responded when the Queen made a request. Over time, informal access could begin to look like institutional authority. That distinction mattered because, once people stopped asking where a request came from, habit could slowly become power. Charles understood exactly what his son meant. The royal household depended on precedent, hierarchy, and assumptions built over years. Precedent, in simple terms, meant the example created by an earlier decision that others might later follow. If nobody could tell whether an instruction was personal, ceremonial, or sovereign, uncertainty would spread through the system until nobody remembered where the original boundary had been. Charles read one page twice. Then he removed his glasses and placed them slowly beside the folder. William did not interrupt. The king finally admitted that he had noticed some of the tension before Anne ever brought the dossier into the room. He had convinced himself that refusing to feed the dispute would allow it to disappear. Instead, silence had allowed it to grow. William answered with painful restraint. By postponing the problem, Charles had left Anne looking confrontational and Camilla looking ambitious, even though both women might believe they were protecting him in completely different ways. The prince was not defending either side. He was telling his father that uncertainty had become the real threat. Charles hated the choice in front of him. It felt less like governance and more like deciding which person he was prepared to hurt. Yet Anne had made one thing impossible. There could be no return to ambiguity. The king pulled a fresh sheet forward and began drafting a directive. Succession planning and constitutional continuity. The arrangements governing how royal authority continues during absence or incapacity would remain with the sovereign, the heir, specifically designated counselors of state, meaning royals legally authorized to perform certain duties for the monarch. and approved officials. Camilla could receive briefings. She could advise Charles privately, but she could not independently alter those arrangements. Charles stopped before signing. Then he asked for Camilla to return alone. William rose and left. As he passed the Queen outside the door, neither spoke. Camilla understood immediately. Anne had forced the question. William had clarified the stakes, but only Charles could deliver the answer. And the moment Camilla stepped back into the room, she knew from her husband's expression that something between them had already changed. Camilla returned expecting an argument. What she found was worse. Charles was calm. The folder had been closed. A single page rested in front of him, and his signature appeared at the bottom. There would be no shouting, no last-minute reversal, and no attempt to pretend Anne's challenge had never happened. The king had acted. Now the woman who had spent years reaching his side had to hear precisely where the limits of that position would remain. Charles explained the directive slowly, almost carefully enough to make the words hurt more. Camilla would remain queen. Her ceremonial duties, charities, household responsibilities, and place beside him would continue. Nothing about their marriage had changed, and nothing about her public standing was being withdrawn. But the new boundary was firm. She would no longer independently intervene in succession planning papers, William's briefings, constitutional continuity arrangements, or decisions assigned directly to Charles and the heir. Constitutional continuity, in plain terms, meant the rules for keeping royal authority functioning if the monarch could not personally carry out every duty. Camilla listened without interrupting. That restraint was more painful than anger. When Charles finished, she removed her glasses, folded them, and placed them beside her handbag. Then she asked the question that exposed the real wound. "Do you think Anne was right about me?" Charles hesitated only briefly. He said Anne was right about the need for clearer boundaries, but wrong if she believed Camilla had deliberately tried to seize power. He wanted that distinction to matter. It did not. Camilla heard only the part she feared most. Her husband had validated the challenge. After everything she had endured to stand beside him, he had now formally agreed that limits around her influence were necessary. She did not argue. She simply looked away, and the silence between them became heavier than the confrontation that had come before. Anne received the news without triumph. William told her Charles had signed the directive, and the Princess Royal exhaled slowly. Relief was there, but so was guilt. She believed the boundary had to be protected, yet she also knew she had forced her brother into a choice that cut directly through his marriage. The consequences spread almost immediately. Charles ordered the new rules circulated only among senior offices, hoping to contain the dispute. But staff noticed changed briefing routes, withdrawn instructions, and Camilla's absence from a continuity meeting she had expected to attend. The palace began adapting before anyone had time to recover emotionally. Then Charles sent Anne a private message. He wanted to see her the next morning. Alone, not as king and princess royal, as brother and sister. Camilla had received the ruling, the palace had begun adjusting to it, and William understood its consequences. But before anyone could move forward, Charles needed one final answer from the sister, who had forced him to make the choice. The next conversation happened without advisors, folders, secretaries, or constitutional language. Charles asked Anne to meet him alone, and for the first time since the crisis began, neither had an institution to hide behind. He was no longer speaking to the Princess Royal, who had challenged the Queen. She was no longer addressing the sovereign whose decision would become palace policy. They were simply brother and sister, and Charles wanted to know whether Anne understood what her intervention had cost him. Charles spoke first. He told Anne that he understood why she had acted, but understanding did not erase the damage. He wished she had trusted him enough to resolve the problem quietly, without forcing the confrontation in front of William and senior officials. For him, that public pressure had turned a difficult family issue into something he could no longer control privately. Anne did not defend herself immediately. Then she said the words Charles had been avoiding. She had trusted him, perhaps for too long. Every warning, every private conversation, every careful attempt to raise the issue had ended the same way. Charles listened, acknowledged the concern, and postponed the painful discussion. The king finally admitted what sat beneath that delay. Challenging Camilla carried emotional weight no protocol file could remove. After everything they had endured before their marriage was fully accepted, he he had developed an instinct to protect her from anything that felt like rejection. That instinct was personal, powerful, and sometimes stronger than he wanted to admit. Anne's anger softened. She told Charles she had never wanted Camilla pushed away from him. She had never questioned the place his wife held in his life. Her fear was different. If staff gradually stopped distinguishing between supporting the Queen and transferring authority to her, then decisions belonging to the sovereign or heir could quietly shift without anyone formally approving it. Anne believed that was the danger she had been trying to stop. Charles looked at his sister for a long moment. Then he gave her the answer she had not expected. Her method had been brutal, he said, but the warning had been necessary. Anne accepted that without satisfaction. She admitted she had hurt Camilla and said she would speak to her directly, rather than allow resentment to harden into something permanent. Charles then revealed that the directive would remain. It was not temporary. William had already been asked to help create clearer written divisions of responsibility across the senior household, so the same confusion could never return. Before Anne left, Charles asked for one final thing. Not as king, as her brother. Meet Camilla privately. End the personal war. Anne agreed. But the family would not get the quiet ending Charles wanted. For the first time, Charles and Anne had reached an understanding. But royal decisions rarely remain private forever, and by the time the family began repairing its wounds, Britain had already noticed that something extraordinary had changed behind the gates. By morning, what had begun around a closed table was no longer a private Windsor dispute. The change in Camilla's role had leaked just enough for the public to understand the central drama. Princess Anne had challenged an internal royal boundary, and Charles had responded with a formal restriction. Suddenly, every gesture was being examined. Every arrival, every expression, every carefully worded palace statement seemed to carry a second meaning, and one photograph outside Buckingham Palace came to symbolize the entire crisis. Charles wanted control of the message before speculation swallowed the truth. Palace communications described the change as a clarification of existing responsibilities. Careful language meant to calm the storm rather than feed it. But that explanation had the opposite effect. A clarification, in simple terms, meant the palace was formally defining who could do what. The public immediately understood the implication. If boundaries needed to be clarified, then somebody inside the royal household believed those boundaries had already become dangerously unclear. Anne found herself at the center of the debate. Some newspapers praised the Princess Royal as the guardian of discipline, a woman willing to protect the monarchy even when the cost was personal. Others focused on Charles, portraying the king as a husband forced to place formal limits around the woman he had spent years defending. Camilla became the emotional center of the controversy, not because she had lost her title, but because the restriction made private tension impossible to ignore. Then one front page changed the tone completely. Outside a kiosk near Victoria Station, a morning newspaper carried the giant headline, "Anne draws the line," beside separate photographs of Anne and Camilla. Commuters stopped. Phones appeared. Within hours, the image was being discussed everywhere, transforming an internal royal dispute into a public symbol of divided authority. Later, a small crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace as Anne's car entered through the gates. Some called her name. Others simply watched, fascinated by the rare sight of royal disagreement becoming visible. The reaction was not entirely against Camilla. Many seemed less interested in choosing sides than in understanding how such a private struggle had reached this point. Camilla saw the coverage and turned the television sound down. Charles entered moments later, noticed the muted screen, and sat beside her. Neither mentioned the headlines. The silence said enough. Anne refused to celebrate. She offered no triumphant statement, while William continued his public schedule without change, signaling stability rather than victory. But Anne had already made another decision. She asked to speak with Camilla alone. The public had chosen its headlines and the palace had established its rules, but the true verdict would not be delivered by newspapers or cheering crowds. It would come in one last private conversation between the two women, whose collision forced Charles to redefine the boundaries of his reign. When Anne and Camilla finally met alone, there was nothing left to fight over. Charles had already signed the directive. William's future authority had been clarified. The household had adjusted its procedures, and Britain had turned the dispute into a national drama. What remained was harder than winning an argument, deciding what the confrontation would mean inside the family. Anne had achieved the boundary she demanded. Camilla had kept her place beside Charles. But neither woman had escaped without being changed. Anne began without excuses. She told Camilla that removing the chair had been intentionally forceful, because she believed another quiet warning would simply disappear into silence. The Princess Royal admitted something else as well. The gesture had humiliated her more deeply than necessary. The directive, meaning Charles's written order defining who could influence specific royal decisions, had already settled the institutional question. Now Anne was dealing with the personal damage left behind. Camilla answered with equal restraint. She accepted that some of her attempts to coordinate royal matters had crossed boundaries, even if she had never considered them an attempt to take authority from William. The Queen admitted that years of being made to feel she had to prove her place had changed the way she reacted to power and exclusion. She had become protective of her position because she feared losing what had taken so long to secure. Anne did not attack that fear. She told Camilla nobody was asking her to disappear, step aside, or surrender her place beside Charles. What mattered was trust. Being the king's wife did not require control over every mechanism surrounding him. Camilla listened, then quietly nodded. For the first time since the crisis began, the anger between them began to loosen. Charles did not reverse the ruling. He kept the division of responsibilities permanent, separating Camilla's role as queen from succession decisions, constitutional continuity, and William's future authority. Constitutional continuity simply meant the system that keeps royal authority functioning if the monarch cannot personally perform every duty. Anne emerged without triumph. Inside the family, her intervention was understood as severe, but necessary after difficult conversations had been delayed too long. Camilla remained beside Charles publicly and privately, but with boundaries she now accepted. That became the true verdict. Anne's shocking move had never been about defeating Camilla. It forced Charles to separate love from authority. He did not choose his sister over his wife. He chose clarity over ambiguity. That is why the chair removed from that Windsor table mattered far beyond one uncomfortable meeting. Anne forced a confrontation Charles desperately wanted to avoid. Camilla reconsidered where influence ended and royal authority began. William received clarity about the future he would inherit. And Charles discovered that protecting the people he loved sometimes required telling them where the boundaries stood. Nobody left untouched, but the monarchy emerged with certainty. The dispute ended not with Camilla defeated, or Anne victorious, but with Charles finally acting as king when silence was no longer possible. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.